In the years following the Civil War, deep in the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains of northeast Georgia nestled the remote town of Hawthorne Hollow. The war had left scars even here, though the mountains had shielded the town from much of the destruction. Still, the people of Hawthorne Hollow were wary of outsiders, especially those who came from the north with their strange accents and unfamiliar ways. The town had been home to many whispers long before the war. Folk talked of strange happenings in the woods, of mysterious lights and eerie sounds that drifted through the trees on cold autumn nights. But none of these tales were more feared than the legend of the Headless Horseman of Hawthorne Hollow. According to local lore, he had once been a Confederate cavalryman named Elijah Morrow, a fearsome soldier known for his loyalty and skill. Elijah had grown up in these mountains, riding through the dense forests long before the war, and he knew the rugged terrain better than any other man in the regiment. His commanders relied on him for scouting and swift ambushes. His horse was as loyal as the man himself, but when the tide of war turned and Confederate forces found themselves desperate, loyalty proved a fragile thing. Elijah's regiment, stationed in the foothills near Hawthorne Hollow, was tasked with holding the line against a Union advance. But supplies were low and the morale of the soldiers had begun to crumble. The officers, desperate to save their own skins, made a secret deal with the enemy. They would surrender, but only if they could guarantee their own safe passage. The enlisted men, including Elijah, would be left behind, expendable in the eyes of the commanders. The betrayal came swift and sudden. Elijah had been sent on a false mission to scout ahead, lured into a Union ambush by his own officers. As the bluecoats surrounded him, cannon fire erupted from the hills, and in the chaos, a single cannonball blasted through the trees, tearing Elijah's head from his shoulders. His horse reared wildly, but his body remained in the saddle, lifeless yet eerily upright. When the battle ended, his comrades found his headless corpse still mounted, a haunting figure, eyes forever shut to the betrayal that had cost him his life. It was said that Elijah's spirit never rested. Instead, he wandered the mountain roads, mounted on his horse, carrying the cannonball that had severed his head. His rage at his officer's treachery burned so fiercely that it transcended death itself, driving him to ride in search of revenge on any man who reminded him of those who had betrayed him, particularly those with power, wealth, and ambition. When Jacob Hensley arrived in the town late one summer, just as the leaves were beginning to hint at the change of seasons, he had no idea of the dark history woven into the town's past. A carpetbagger from the north, Jacob had come to Hawthorne Hollow to buy up land for cheap and exploit the locals, seeing their simple rustic ways as opportunities for personal gain. Tall, well-dressed, and with a sharp tongue, Jacob dismissed the warnings about the Headless Horseman as mere superstition. He had made his fortune off the backs of desperate Southerners, taking advantage of the chaos left in the wake of the war. He saw Hawthorne Hollow as just another town ripe for exploitation. The townsfolk, still nursing old wounds, took to Jacob with cold civility. They saw him for what he was, a scavenger of their misfortune, but he cared little for their feelings. His eye was on the profit to be made, and the ghost stories did nothing to deter him. By the time the leaves had turned to brilliant shades of red and gold, Jacob had already secured several key pieces of land, including an old Confederate officer's estate. The deal had been lucrative, the papers signed over in haste by the desperate descendants who wanted to be rid of the past. Jacob lingered at the local tavern that evening, celebrating his most recent acquisition. His mocking laughter filled the air as he regaled the locals with tales of his success. "You people and your ghost stories," he slurred as the whiskey warmed him. "A headless cavalryman riding through the woods with a cannonball in hand? I've seen worse in the war, let me tell you that. There's no ghost gonna frighten me off." An old man sitting in the corner, who had been silent most of the evening, finally spoke up. His voice was hoarse but steady. "You laugh now, but Elijah Morrow don't take kindly to men like you." Jacob sneered, raising his glass mockingly. "Elijah Morrow, is it? Well, if this ghost shows up, I'll give him a piece of my mind. Maybe I'll offer to buy his land, too." But as the wind outside howled and the fire in the hearth began to die down, the men around the table grew quiet. They glanced at each other uneasily, and Jacob's laughter slowly faded as he realized nobody was amused. Still, the whiskey dulled his senses to the warnings. He mounted his horse that night, later than he should have, and set out for the boarding house where he was staying. The road was long and winding, cutting through dense woods that pressed in on either side, the trees black silhouettes against the night sky. The moon hung low, casting pale light on the narrow path ahead. Jacob was alone, or so he thought. As he rode, a cold wind began to stir, an unnatural chill that seeped into his bones. The air around him felt thick, heavy with something he couldn't name. The rhythmic sounds of his horse's hooves on the dirt path echoed in the silence, but soon another sound joined it. Hoofbeats, distant but growing louder. Jacob frowned, glancing over his shoulder, but the road behind him was empty. He urged his horse onward, faster now. The sound of hooves grew closer, accompanied by a strange metallic clinking, like something heavy dragging behind the rider. His heart began to pound in his chest as he realized the hoofbeats were closing in. He turned again, and what he saw made the blood drain from his face. A figure loomed in the distance, shrouded in mist. The rider sat tall on a great black horse, but where the man's head should have been, there was only a gaping void. In his right hand, the ghostly rider held a large cannonball, its dark surface gleaming in the moonlight. It was Elijah Morrow, and he had come for Jacob. The headless specter spurred his horse forward with the cannonball clutched in his fist like a grim reminder of the treachery that had cost him his life. Jacob, in a blind panic, urged his horse faster, racing down the narrow mountain road. But no matter how fast he rode, the headless horseman gained on him, the thunderous pounding of hooves growing even louder. Jacob's horse stumbled briefly on a root, throwing him forward in the saddle. He fought to regain control, but the ghost was nearly upon him. The cold, clammy air around the rider seemed to seep into Jacob's skin, filling him with a dread he had never known. He could hear the hollow clink of the cannonball as it bounced against the dirt, dragging through the leaves. Suddenly, the horseman raised the cannonball high as if preparing to strike. In a moment of blind terror, Jacob veered his horse off the road, plunging into the dense underbrush. Branches tore at his face and clothes, and his horse whinnied in panic, stumbling through the thicket. But the horseman did not relent, crashing through the trees with the relentless determination of a man wronged. Jacob's horse stumbled again, and this time the fall sent Jacob tumbling to the ground. He landed hard, gasping for breath as he scrambled to his feet, but the horseman was already there, towering over him. Jacob stared in horror at the rider's neck where the gaping wound from the cannonball was still visible, the ragged edges of flesh a grotesque reminder of the betrayal that had condemned the man's soul. The horseman paused for a moment, as if savoring the fear in Jacob's eyes. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he hurled the cannonball straight at Jacob's chest. The impact knocked the wind from Jacob's lungs, and the world around him went black. The next morning, the townspeople found Jacob's horse wandering near the old battlefield, but there was no sign of the man himself. All that remained was a single cannonball lying in the dirt, and the unmistakable chill of vengeance in the air. The legend of the Headless Horseman of Hawthorne Hollow lived on, stronger than ever, and in the quiet whispers of the town it was said that Elijah Morrow had found a new victim, another man who thought he could profit from betrayal.